about Android development. What is it comprised of? Again, it is writing code in Java. However, one thing to keep in mind, if you're familiar with a bit about Java, most people will go out there and if they need to run a little bit of Java code, they'll get something known as the Java runtime environment. You are going to need something called the Java JDK, the full development toolkit, not just the runtime environment. As we start to develop, we need that actual JDK to be able to do things like compile. So don't get just the runtime, get the full JDK. And as of the current versions of Android, we're talking about running on Java 5 or 6. In fact, for those who are aware, yes, there is Java 7 out there in place today. Android is not yet up to running in the Java 7 realm. So keep it at the Java 5 or 6. And those IDEs that we have to develop code allow you to essentially pick what version of Java you're actually producing to. Once you've got the JDK in place, again, you're going to need the various toolkits in place. How do you get those? How do you get the Android SDK? You actually get the Android SDK by going out and downloading something known as the starter package. Now, this is a little bit goofy, folks, but the idea here is there are various set of platforms you might actually build to. Yep, we've got all sorts of smartphones from the HTC vendors to the Motorola vendors, but then we've got things like tablets, all sorts of devices out there. So this SDK starter package essentially allows you to download additional components, emulators, tools, add-ons, and things that you need specific to your target platforms. So this Android starter package is nothing more than essentially an original download that allows you to go get the other components, emulators, tools, and such that you need. So it's a little bit goofy the way the Android SDK is obtained. You get the starter package through the starter package, which brings up a little UI like I've got pictured over here. You tell it what other parts of the SDK, the full SDK you want. And that's when it goes off and works to bring those SDK components into your development environment. As far as the Eclipse IDE is concerned, again, you'll need that plugin to make sure you can do work in Eclipse. Now, to be truthful here, you don't absolutely need Eclipse. You don't absolutely need the software that's a plug-in in Eclipse to do Android development. You can actually do everything with something like Notepad or TextPad, but boy, that would be the hard way to do things, the real hard way. I would highly recommend you actually get the Eclipse IDE. It's going to make your life a lot easier. Just like doing .NET development outside of Visual Studio is possible, nobody really wants to do that unless there's some unusual reason for doing so. As I mentioned, you don't need an actual device to develop and test Android applications. You can use what are known as Emulator. They come with the Android SDK. Again, based on your kind of criteria, you can set up all sorts of emulators based on your target devices. One thing I should note, though, is that nothing really beats, a final device, a real device for testing. The nice thing about Android development, it differs from, say, something like iOS development in that you can download immediately applications right onto your own device if you have one. You can do that in several different ways, but most of us as development crews actually do it directly from our laptops through a USB connection right to our device. So a little bit unusual in that respect, in that it's very easy to get applications on and off our devices. You have to do a little bit of configuration on your device, as you might imagine. You have to allow for that kind of communication and setup and testing of an app. But it does provide for some neat capability, and in fact, you can actually debug and step through code running directly on your device as well. No time to go into some of the details of that today, but just note that is a capability most of us take advantage of. One thing to also know with regard to Android development, you need to know that there are several platforms out there and therefore several versions of Android. As you can see by the chart I've provided over here, the current distribution is kind of spread out, at least by and large, across two major versions, version 2.2 and 2.3. In fact, the Windows Azure Toolkit for Android libraries are actually written to the 2.2 level. So just be aware that if you want to do Windows Azure work with Android, you're going to have to at least be at that 2.2 level. And obviously the devices have to be at that 2.2 level as well. What is maybe a bit troublesome to a lot of initial developers in the Android community is that by default, Android, that is the operating system and everything concerned with Android application development, figures that you're going to support all versions and you support all devices, meaning you support big and small displays, tablets, all sorts of capabilities out there. Obviously, that's probably not going to be the case. So it is really up to you. It's incumbent upon you as an Android developer to specify in something called an Android manifest file. We'll talk more about what that is coming up in just a second. What particular devices your application supports, what versions of Android you support, things of that nature. If you don't do that, then anybody who gets a hold of your application can put it on their Android device and suffer the consequences, meaning they're usually a little bit frustrated by the fact that it may not work or work correctly. So one thing you want to do as a Windows Azure developer making an application for Android is make sure you pick the right target audience, pick the right versions you're going to support and the capabilities you're going to support, and make sure you specify that in the Android manifest. Something that is kind of a problem for all of us as far as Android development is concerned. Even a name is applied to this, device fragmentation. All right, when you build an Android project, what are you going to see? If you use Eclipse to build an application, you're going to see a fairly complex project structure. And I'm not going to go into all the gory details of this. In fact, I'll show you a Hello World application just to kind of get you familiar with this idea. But Android projects essentially are broken up into source code. This is where you actually put your Java components that you're building. Then we have a certain amount of generated code. In other words, the Android SDK actually develops a certain amount of code for you. In particular, it likes to do things by good old-fashioned resource files, and those resource files have to be identified, and that's done as something called an RJava file that gets constantly generated by the SDK. So one of the things you will see is this gen folder. Don't want to touch that. In fact, don't want to do any work around that area. Let the Android SDK through your Eclipse IDE take care of all that work for you. So I mentioned a lot of things in Android are done via resource file. In fact, the entire graphical layout is done by resource file, essentially an XML file that lets you set up the UI. Things like labels and images, all done via resource file. So you'll see a whole collection of resource files in an Android project. And then again, the all-important Android manifest file. This is the foundation of any Android application. It describes all the components you have in your Android app, tells you what versions you're going to support, how the application works, how components are allowed to communicate, and lots more. This is kind of the gem of the Android application from an understanding perspective, both on the part of the OS as well as the developer on how it operates. Learning about what goes in the Android manifest file is paramount to kind of understanding how Android apps work. In other words, you have to really know more about the Android manifest file along with Java development in order to be able to really start to appreciate how Android apps work. So when we're building an Android app, what does that really mean? Well, Android applications are a little bit different than, at least from my experience, building other types of applications. Yes, we do have this idea of components, but from an Android perspective, applications are really just a loose affiliation of those components. In other words, there isn't any single entry point defined from an Android perspective about how applications start. There's no main method, if you will. There's no one class that says, here is the kickoff point. You can use just about any component as kickoff point. Some could be visual, some could be non-visual. In fact, one of the benefits of Android is it provides for a background service type application that might have no UI. So components are something that have to be welded together, if you will, by things like the Android manifest file. You can provide all sorts of building blocks, and a short list of kind of the more common building blocks, or if you will, building components in an Android application include activities. These are essentially our screens in our Android world, full of all sorts of what are called widgets. Technical name for those are view components. So a view component might be something like a text entry field. So activities of the screen, views of the components that go inside of a screen. Interestingly, Android only allows for one activity to be, if you will, active, or the topmost activity at any one time. So if you bring up your phone, for example, on the Android device, all other applications, all of the activities, if you will, kind of halt or at least suspend while that phone conversation is going on. Your application works in the very same fashion. So one activity at a time kind of environment. We have things that are called intents. This is essentially our mechanism for communicating between components in our Android world. Activity to activity or activity to background service. You use an intent to communicate amongst the various loosely affiliated components in Android. Services are background services. For those who know Azure, think of these as kind of the worker role components inside of Android. Then we have all sorts of other components, things like content providers. For those who do Azure work, again, think of a storage mechanism, a loose way of doing either relational or structured data, as well as even things like blobs or other loose text out there could be set up as a content provider that your application could use. And then there are various other components. In fact, there's probably about a dozen other components that get used in various fashion in Android. Won't go into all the gory details. Most applications are going to be comprised of activities and services and intents. And if your application uses a lot of data, it might have a fair number of content providers as well. Again, all these have to be specified in the Android manifest file.